My name is Evan Mitchell, and I'm writing this account 3 months after the events I'm about to describe. I've been advised by my therapist to document everything, to help process what happened. I'm not sure it will help, but I need to tell someone, and maybe this will serve as a warning to others who might find themselves in similar circumstances. I was 23 when I arrived in Millbrook, Kansas. Population 847 according to the faded sign at the town limits. It wasn't a destination I'd chosen, so much as a place where my rusted Honda Civic had finally given up. Steam billowing from under the hood on a stretch of Route 54 that seemed to extend into infinity in both directions. The nearest mechanic was closed for the weekend, and my savings account held exactly $37 and change. The diner appeared like a mirage through the heat shimmer, chrome siding dulled by decades of prairie dust, a neon sign that read Mel's All-Night Diner in letters that flickered erratically, some dark entirely. The building looked like it had been transplanted from 1955 and left to weather the Kansas winds ever since. It sat alone beside the highway, surrounded by an ocean of wheat that stretched to every horizon, broken only by the occasional grain elevator or farmhouse in the distance. Inside, the smell hit me first: burnt coffee, fryer oil, and something else I couldn't identify, something stale and lingering. The interior matched the exterior's vintage aesthetic: red vinyl booths with duct-taped tiers, a counter with chrome stools, and a jukebox in the corner that looked like it hadn't played a song since the Eisenhower administration. The linoleum floor bore the scuff marks of countless boots, and the fluorescent lights hummed with an irregular rhythm that made my eye twitch. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s, grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a stained apron over a blue waitress uniform. Her name tag read Doris, and her eyes held the tired wisdom of someone who'd seen too much of life's harder edges. "You looking for work or just coffee?" she asked, not looking up from wiping down the already clean counter. "Work, actually. My car broke down and I'm kind of stranded until I can afford to fix it." She studied me then, taking in my wrinkled clothes and the desperation I was trying to hide. "Can you work nights?" "Graveyard shift, 11 to 7. Most folks don't last long on the overnight." "I can work any shift you need." She nodded slowly, then reached under the counter and pulled out a laminated sheet of paper. "These are the night shift rules. Read them over, memorize them, and follow them exactly. No exceptions." I took the sheet, glancing at the title, Night Shift Rules, Mel's All-Night Diner. Below it, 9 rules were listed in neat, typed text. Keep the jukebox unplugged after midnight. Never refill coffee for the man in the black hat. Don't unlock the doors after 3:17 a.m., no matter who asks. If the lights flicker, don't look out the windows. If the payphone rings between 2 and 4 a.m., let it ring. Do not answer. The coffee pot in the back room stays empty after 1 a.m. Never acknowledge the woman who sits in booth 7 after midnight. If you hear music from the jukebox while it's unplugged, don't move until it stops. Count the customers every hour. If there are more than you served, close your eyes and count again. I couldn't help but chuckle. Is this some kind of initiation thing? Like fraternity hazing for diner workers? Doris's expression didn't change. "You think this is funny?" "Well, I mean, don't refill coffee for the man in the black hat. Never acknowledge the woman in booth 7. It sounds like something out of a ghost story." She took the sheet back from my hands, folded it carefully, and slipped it into the front pocket of my shirt. "Kid, I've been running this place for 32 years. I've hired maybe 40 people for the night shift in that time. You know how many are still alive?" The casual way she said "still alive" made my stomach clench. What do you mean?" 7. 7 are still alive, and only because they followed the rules." She leaned across the counter, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This isn't hazing, son. This is survival. You want the job, you follow the rules. Every single one, every single night. No exceptions, no questions, no testing to see what happens if you break them. Are we clear?" I stared at her weathered face, searching for any sign that this was an elaborate joke. I found none. The fluorescent light above us flickered once, and I noticed Doris's eyes immediately dart toward the windows before snapping back to me. "Crystal clear," I said, though my mouth had gone dry. "Good, you start tonight. Kyle will train you. He's been here a few months now. And Evan, She waited until I met her eyes again. "Welcome to Mel's. I hope you're one of the smart ones." My first night at Mel's passed in a blur of learning the coffee machine, memorizing where everything was stored, and getting acquainted with Kyle Brennan, the line cook, who would be my only companion during the overnight hours. Kyle was maybe 25, with sandy hair and the kind of easy grin that suggested he'd never encountered a problem he couldn't charm his way out of. He'd been working at the diner for 3 months, he told me. Kyle seemed entirely too relaxed for someone who'd presumably been given the same rule sheet I'd received. "Don't tell me Doris gave you the spook list," he said around 11:30, nodding toward the laminated sheet I'd been studying. "That old broad loves her ghost stories. Been trying to scare the newbies for decades, I bet. You don't follow the rules?" Kyle laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the empty diner. "I mean, I keep the jukebox unplugged because it's old and probably a fire hazard. And I don't answer the payphone because who the hell calls a diner at 3 in the morning? But all that supernatural nonsense. Come on, man. We're in Kansas, not some Stephen King novel." I wanted to believe him. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through 3 years of college before I'd run out of money, agreed completely. The rules did sound absurd, but something about the way Doris had delivered them, the absolute seriousness in her voice when she'd mentioned the body count, kept me on edge. The dinner rush, such as it was, consisted of 5 customers, 3 truckers, a farmer heading home late from market, and a woman traveling with 2 young children who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Normal people with normal problems, eating normal food in a perfectly ordinary diner. By midnight we were alone, see? Kyle said, gesturing around the empty restaurant. Just another boring night in the middle of nowhere. No ghosts, no mysterious strangers, no supernatural. He was interrupted by the slow, deliberate sound of gravel crunching in the parking lot. We both looked toward the windows, but the angle made it impossible to see what had arrived. A few seconds later, footsteps approached the front door. The clock on the wall read 3:16 a.m. "We're about to close," Kyle called toward the door, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the entrance. I found myself reaching for the rule sheet in my pocket, my heart beginning to race for reasons I couldn't articulate. Rule number 3 echoed in my mind. Don't unlock the doors after 3:17 a.m., no matter who asks. The digital clock on the register flipped to 3:17 immediately. The door handle began to rattle, not the casual turning of someone trying to enter, but a violent, sustained shaking that made the entire door frame vibrate. Kyle and I both froze, staring at the entrance. "Maybe they didn't hear you," I whispered, though something told me to keep my voice down. Kyle started toward the door. "Hey!" he called out. "We're closed!" The rattling stopped. Through the glass I could make out a figure, tall, thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned suit. The person pressed their face against the window. And even from across the diner, I could see their pale skin, unnaturally white in the flickering neon light. "Sir, we're closed," Kyle repeated, his voice less confident now. "You'll have to come back in the morning." The figure's mouth began to move, but no sound penetrated the glass. Their lips formed words I couldn't make out, repeated over and over with increasing urgency. Their hands pressed flat against the window on either side of their face. "What's he saying?" Kyle asked, moving closer to the door. I pulled the rule sheet from my pocket with trembling hands. "Kyle, don't unlock the door. Rule number 3 says, screw the rules, Evan. Guy might be having some kind of emergency." But as Kyle reached for the deadbolt, something changed about the figure outside. Their face, pressed against the glass, began to stretch. Not like someone pressing harder, but like the flesh itself was becoming malleable, elongating horizontally across the window. Their mouth stretched into an impossible grin that extended nearly to their ears, and their eyes never blinked. Kyle's hand stopped inches from the lock. What the hell? The stretched face remained pressed against the glass for perhaps 30 seconds, that horrible grin never wavering, before suddenly snapping back to normal proportions. The figure straightened, gave us a casual wave, and walked back into the darkness beyond the reach of the parking lot lights. We stood in silence for several minutes, staring at the empty doorway. Finally, Kyle cleared his throat. "Okay," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "That was weird. Probably just some drunk playing games. Rural areas get their share of weirdos." I nodded, but I was studying the window where the figure's face had pressed against the glass. In the morning light, I told myself, we'd probably find nothing. Just condensation, maybe some smudges. But in that moment, I could swear I saw the outline of that impossible grin still fogged on the glass. Yeah, I agreed, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. Just some drunk. Neither of us mentioned that the figure hadn't stumbled, hadn't smelled of alcohol, hadn't shown any of the typical signs of intoxication. Neither of us talked about how their suit had looked decades out of style, or how their skin had been so pale it seemed to glow, and neither of us could explain why. When I finally worked up the courage to check the parking lot through the side window, there were no tire tracks in the gravel, no footprints in the dust, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Over the next week, Kyle and I settled into an uneasy routine. He maintained his skeptical stance about the rules, though I noticed he no longer made jokes about them. The incident with the elongated face had shaken him, even if he wouldn't admit it. For my part, I found myself studying that laminated sheet during every quiet moment, memorizing not just the rules themselves, but their exact wording, searching for clues about what we were really dealing with. Kyle Brennan had been working at Mel's for 3 months before I arrived, and in that time, he developed the casual confidence of someone who'd survived his probationary period. He was the kind of person who'd talk back to teachers, question authority, test boundaries, just to see what would happen. Under normal circumstances, I might have admired that quality. In our current situation, it terrified me. "You're getting paranoid," he told me on my 7th night, watching me carefully unplug the jukebox as the clock approached midnight. "Look around, Evan. This is a diner in Kansas. The most dangerous thing we're likely to encounter is a trucker with road rage or maybe a coyote in the parking lot. Then why do the rules exist? Insurance liability, probably. Or maybe Doris is just eccentric. Small-town business owners develop weird quirks after decades of dealing with the public." He gestured toward the payphone, mounted on the wall near the restrooms. "I mean, come on, don't answer the phone between 2 and 4? That's not supernatural, that's just good customer service. What kind of legitimate call comes in at 3 in the morning?" As if summoned by his words, the payphone began to ring. The sound cut through the diner's ambient hum like a knife. I checked the clock. 2:47 a.m. Kyle and I both stared at the phone, its shrill bell echoing off the chrome and vinyl. "Don't answer it," I said, pulling the rule sheet from my pocket. "Rule number 5 is bullshit," Kyle finished, pushing past me toward the phone. "Watch this." The phone continued its insistent ringing as Kyle approached. I wanted to tackle him, to physically prevent him from breaking the rule. But something held me frozen in place, not courage, but a terrible certainty that I was about to witness something I didn't want to see. Kyle lifted the receiver on the 8th ring. "Mel's all-night diner," he said, his voice carrying that cocky confidence I'd come to dread. "We're open 24 hours, but if this is some prank call..." His expression changed immediately. The grin faded from his face, replaced by confusion, then growing alarm. He held the receiver away from his ear, staring at it as if it had turned into a snake. "What is it?" I whispered. Kyle's face had gone pale. He pressed the receiver back to his ear, listening intently. After a moment he spoke again, but his voice was different, smaller, uncertain. "Hello? Who is this?" Another pause. Kyle's free hand began to tremble. That's not possible," he said into the phone. "This is some kind of joke, right? Some kind of recording?" I moved closer, trying to hear what was being said on the other end of the line, but Kyle suddenly slammed the receiver back onto its cradle. The diner fell silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of wind in the wheat fields. "What did they say?" I asked. Kyle stood with his back to me, one hand still resting on the phone. His shoulders were tense, and I could see his reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. "Kyle?" He turned around, and for a moment, he looked like he was going to be sick. Then slowly his usual grin returned, though it seemed forced now, brittle around the edges. "Nothing," he said. "Just some kid playing games. Probably recorded my voice earlier and played it back to freak me out. You know how these pranks work. What exactly did you hear? Doesn't matter. It was just a prank." But his voice carried no conviction, and he kept glancing back at the payphone, as if it might ring again at any moment. I waited until Kyle went into the kitchen to prep for the morning rush before examining the phone more closely. The receiver looked normal, black plastic, slightly worn from decades of use. But as I leaned in to inspect it, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were scratches on the handset. Not random scuffs from normal wear, but deliberate gouges that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. The marks were fresh, cutting through the accumulated grime and revealing the plastic underneath. They formed a pattern that took me a moment to recognize, 5 parallel lines, repeated several times around the receiver's circumference. Claw marks. I looked back toward the kitchen, where I could hear Kyle moving around with unusual agitation, banging pots and utensils more forcefully than necessary. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he avoided making eye contact, focusing intently on cleaning equipment that was already spotless. "Kyle," I said carefully, "what did the voice on the phone really say?" He stopped wiping down the counter and looked at me directly for the first time since hanging up the phone. In that moment, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, genuine fear. "It said," he began, then stopped, shaking his head. "No, it was just a prank. Some kid with a recording." "What did it say?" Kyle set down the towel and gripped the edge of the counter. His knuckles were white. "It said, 'I'm right behind you,' in my own voice." "Exactly my voice, Evan. Not similar, not close, identical." Like I was talking to myself. He looked toward the payphone, then quickly away. And when I turned around to look, I could swear I saw... But that's impossible. It was just the reflection in the chrome, playing tricks. "What did you see?" "Nothing. Just shadows and reflections. The mind plays tricks when you're tired, but I noticed that for the rest of the night, Kyle positioned himself so he could always see behind him, and he never turned his back to the payphone again. More telling, when 4 a.m. passed and the phone remained silent, I saw his shoulders relax for the first time in over an hour. The rules weren't suggestions, I realized. They weren't insurance policies or quirky traditions or the eccentricities of a long-time business owner. They were survival instructions, written by people who'd learned the hard way what happened when you ignored them. The incident with the payphone marked a turning point. Kyle still maintained his skeptical facade during our conversations, but I caught him studying the rule sheet when he thought I wasn't looking. More significantly, he'd developed nervous habits, checking locks repeatedly, glancing over his shoulder, and jumping at sounds that had never bothered him before. The cocky confidence that had defined him was cracking, and something much more vulnerable was showing through. For my part, I'd moved beyond simple compliance with the rules to active investigation. During slow periods, I began exploring the diner more thoroughly, searching for clues about its history and the origins of our mysterious instructions. The building was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a storage room, employee break area, and manager's office extending behind the main dining area. It was in the storage room, while looking for extra napkin dispensers, that I made my first significant discovery. The room smelled of dust and old cardboard, lit by a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows between the shelves of supplies. Most of the boxes contained exactly what you'd expect: paper products, cleaning supplies, backup equipment for the kitchen. But tucked behind a stack of syrup containers, I found a metal filing cabinet with a lock that had long since broken. The top drawer contained normal business records, tax documents, supplier invoices, employee timesheets dating back several years. But the bottom drawer held something much more interesting: a collection of notebooks, journals, and loose papers that appeared to be personal accounts from previous night shift employees. The earliest entry I could find was dated 15 years ago, written in careful cursive handwriting. "Third week at Mel's. Doris gave me the rules, same as everyone, I guess. Thought they were crazy at first. Tonight the jukebox played Love Me Tender 3 times in a row, even though I'd unplugged it like rule number 1 says. Sat perfectly still until it stopped. Jimmy thinks I'm being paranoid, but I remember what happened to Marcus. Following every rule from now on. Sarah." I flipped through more entries, finding accounts from dozens of different people over the years. The handwriting changed, the dates progressed, but the content remained disturbingly consistent. References to the man in the black hat, who appeared sporadically but never ordered anything except coffee. Descriptions of the woman in booth 7, who would sit motionless for hours, never aging, never speaking. Multiple accounts of the 3:17 a.m. visitors and the terrible consequences of letting them inside. One entry, written in shaky block letters, made my hands tremble. Day 47, Kyle broke rule number 4 last night. Looked out the window when the lights flickered. Started screaming about faces in the wheat. said they were calling his name, had to hold him down to stop him from running outside. This morning he says he doesn't remember, but his eyes are different now, darker. Sometimes when he thinks I'm not looking, I catch him staring at the door locks. I think whatever he saw out there is still with him. I don't know what to do. Jennifer. The entry was dated 8 months ago. I checked the employee records in the top drawer and found Jennifer Martinez listed as a night shift worker, terminated after 7 weeks for abandonment of position. There was no mention of Kyle in any of the official records. Spent the rest of my break reading through the informal logbook that previous employees had apparently maintained in secret. The accounts painted a picture of the diner as something far more dangerous than a simple restaurant. According to these witnesses, Mel's all-night diner sat on what multiple people described as thin ground, a place where the normal rules of reality wore thin after dark, allowing things from elsewhere to press against our world. The rules weren't arbitrary restrictions. They were a carefully developed protocol, refined over decades of trial and error, designed to maintain the delicate balance that kept both the employees and the customers safe. Each rule addressed a specific threat, though the nature of those threats was only hinted at in the fragmentary accounts I was reading. The most unsettling discovery was a list tucked into the back of the most recent notebook, a handwritten roster of night shift employees with dates of hire and, in too many cases, dates of disappearance. The list went back 20 years and included 43 names. Of those, 36 were marked as missing, disappeared, or simply gone. 7 names were marked survived, transferred to day shift. I was studying this list when I heard footsteps in the main dining area. Quickly, I shoved the notebooks back into the filing cabinet and returned to the front of the diner, where Kyle was setting up for the coffee service. "Where'd you go?" he asked, and I noticed his voice carried a new edge of anxiety whenever I was out of sight. "Just looking for supplies," I said. "Kyle, how long did you say you'd been working here?" 3 months. Why? I wanted to tell him what I'd found, wanted to show him the roster with its grim statistics and the accounts from previous workers. But something held me back, a growing suspicion that Kyle's version of events might not be entirely accurate. No reason. Just curious about the turnover rate. That night, as we went through our usual routines, I found myself watching Kyle more carefully. He followed the rules now, I noticed, but with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions rather than the careful attention of someone who understood their importance. And occasionally, when he thought I wasn't looking, I caught him staring at the windows with an expression I couldn't quite read. When the lights flickered at 2:30 a.m., a brief, barely noticeable dimming, Kyle's reaction was immediate and violent. He spun away from the windows so fast, he nearly knocked over a coffee pot, his face pale and his breathing rapid. "Just a power fluctuation," he said. But he kept his eyes firmly fixed on the floor until the lights steadied. I remembered rule number 4. If the lights flicker, don't look out the windows. And I remembered the account I'd read about a previous Kyle, who'd broken that rule and been forever changed by what he'd seen. Looking at my co-worker now, really looking at him, I began to notice things that should have been obvious before. His eyes were indeed darker than they'd been on my first night. Though the change had been so gradual, I'd attributed it to fatigue. His movements had taken on a fluid quality that didn't quite match his personality. And sometimes when he smiled, I could swear I saw too many teeth. It was during my 3rd week at Mel's that I first encountered Harlan Ketchum, though I wouldn't learn his name until much later. He appeared on a Tuesday night around 1:30 a.m., materializing from the darkness beyond the parking lot lights, like a figure stepping out of the wheat fields themselves. I saw him approaching through the window, a tall, weathered man in his 70s, wearing a trucker's cap and a denim jacket that had seen better decades. Kyle was in the back restocking supplies when the man entered, the door chime announcing his arrival with its familiar ding. He moved with the careful gait of someone whose joints had logged too many miles, but his eyes were sharp and alert as they swept the diner's interior. "Coffee, please," he said, settling into the booth farthest from the windows. "Black?" I poured his cup and set it down, noticing the way he positioned himself to keep both the front door and the kitchen entrance in his line of sight. His hands were gnarled with age and hard work, but they remained perfectly steady as he lifted the coffee to his lips. "First time seeing you here," I said. making conversation during what had been a quiet night. "First time you've been here when I've come through," he replied. "I make this run maybe once a month. Always the same route, always the same time. Long-haul trucker?" He nodded toward the parking lot, where I could now see the running lights of an 18-wheeler parked in the shadows beyond the reach of our neon sign. 43 years behind the wheel. Seen a lot of road, a lot of stops. He studied me over the rim of his coffee cup. "You're the new night shift kid." It wasn't a question. "How did you—" Word gets around. Small communities, smaller still at this hour. He took another sip of coffee. "You following Doris's rules?" The question caught me off guard. "You know about the rules?" "Son, I've been driving through this part of Kansas since before you were born. I've seen what happens to night shift workers who don't follow them." He gestured toward the empty booth across from him. "Sit down. We need to talk." I glanced toward the kitchen where Kyle was still occupied with inventory. Something about the old trucker's tone suggested this was a conversation best kept private. "I can't leave the counter unattended," I said. "Your friend back there isn't going anywhere. And it's past the witching hour anyway. Anyone else comes through that door, you'll want to be following rule number 3 regardless." He fixed me with a stare that seemed to look straight through me. "Sit down, Evan." The use of my name decided it. I grabbed the coffee pot and walked to his booth, refilling his cup as I slid into the seat across from him. "How do you know my name?" "Same way I know you found Jennifer's notebooks in the back room. Same way I know your coworker Kyle isn't exactly the same person who answered my questions 3 months ago." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This place has a way of getting talked about among folks who drive the night roads. We keep track of who's working where, who's missing, who's changed. Changed how?" Harlan was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if reading tea leaves. "You ever wonder why Doris only hires for the night shift? Why she never works these hours herself anymore? I assumed it was just she used to work nights. 25 years ago, when her husband first bought this place, Mel Kowalski, the original owner, disappeared one night in '99. Found his car in the parking lot, keys still in the ignition, coffee still warm on the counter. Never found him." He traced the rim of his cup with one finger. "Doris took over the business, but she learned real quick that some jobs are too dangerous for the person in charge." "What exactly is this place?" "Crossroads," he said simply. "Some places, the barriers between what is and what might be get thin. Usually it's places where tragedy happened, or where the land itself has been disturbed. This stretch of highway, this particular patch of ground, it's been a way station for things that shouldn't exist for longer than anyone remembers." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of things?" "The kind that follow rules of their own, mostly. They can't just take what they want. There are older laws that govern these interactions. But they can wait and they can test, and they can try to trick folks into making mistakes." He met my eyes. "The rules Doris gave you?" "They're not her rules. They're the terms of a treaty that's been negotiated over decades of loss and trial and error." "A treaty with what?" "Things that were here before the highway, before the wheat, before the settlers. Things that remember when this land was different." He finished his coffee and set the cup down with deliberate care. "They can't cross the threshold uninvited after 3:17. They can't take someone who doesn't answer their calls. They can't claim someone who doesn't look when they're not supposed to look, doesn't move when they're supposed to be still. But if someone breaks the rules," Harlan's expression darkened, "then the treaty is void, at least for that person, and things that have been waiting patiently for their chance get to collect what they're owed." I thought about Kyle, about his changed eyes and strange behavior since the phone call. "What happens to people who get collected?" "Depends on which rules they broke and how badly. Sometimes they just disappear, vanish like Mel did, never to be seen again. Sometimes they get replaced." He stood up, pulling a few dollar bills from his pocket and leaving them on the table. "And sometimes they come back, but they're not quite the same person who left." "Harlan," I called as he started toward the door, realizing I'd somehow learned his name during our conversation. "How do you know so much about all this?" He paused with his hand on the door handle. "Because I used to work the night shift myself. Back in '78. Lasted 6 months before I was smart enough to quit and find a different way to make a living." He looked back at me with something that might have been pity. "I was one of the lucky ones, kid. I followed the rules, kept my head down, and got out before the land decided it wanted to keep me. Any advice?" "Yeah, when the jukebox plays on its own, and it will, don't dance. Don't tap your foot. Don't nod your head, don't even think about the rhythm. Pretend you're made of stone until it stops. He opened the door, letting in the cool night air and the sound of wheat rustling in the wind. And whatever you do, don't trust everything your coworker tells you. Some of the things that come back look exactly like the people who left, but they're not. They remember how to act human, but they're following different rules now. After he left, I sat in the empty diner, processing what I'd learned. The notebook entries made more sense now. They weren't just accounts of strange experiences, but documentation of an ongoing supernatural conflict with established rules and consequences. More troubling was Harlan's warning about Kyle. I thought back over the past few weeks, trying to remember exactly when Kyle's behavior had started to change. The phone call had been the obvious turning point, but now that I was paying attention, I could trace smaller changes back even further. When had his eyes started getting darker? When had his smile started looking just slightly wrong? And most importantly, if Kyle had been collected and replaced, what did that mean for my own safety? From the kitchen came the sound of Kyle humming, a tune I didn't recognize, something that seemed to echo strangely in the confined space. I found myself listening carefully to the melody, and with growing alarm, realized it sounded like the song that had been playing from the jukebox on my first night, even though the machine had been unplugged. Rule number 8 echoed in my mind. If you hear music from the jukebox while it's unplugged, don't move until it stops. But this wasn't coming from the jukebox. This was coming from Kyle, and I had no idea what rule governed that situation. The revelation about Kyle's true nature, or what he might have become, transformed every interaction into a minefield of uncertainty. I found myself analyzing his every word, gesture, and expression for signs of the humanity I'd initially known versus whatever might have taken his place. The worst part was that most of the time, he seemed completely normal. The same easy laugh, the same casual attitude toward work, the same tendency to complain about difficult customers. If Harlan hadn't warned me, I might never have noticed the subtle wrongness that had crept into his behavior. But now that I was looking for it, the signs were everywhere. Kyle's eating habits had changed. I'd never seen him consume anything more substantial than coffee and the occasional piece of toast during our shifts, despite the ready availability of diner food. When I mentioned this, he claimed he'd been trying to lose weight, but I noticed he'd actually gotten thinner since I'd started working there. Not healthy or thin, but gaunt, as if something essential was being slowly drained from him. His knowledge of the diner's operations had also shifted in odd ways. Sometimes he'd forget basic procedures he'd supposedly been doing for months, while other times he'd demonstrate familiarity with equipment and storage areas that Doris had never shown him. When I asked about these inconsistencies, he'd deflect with jokes or change the subject entirely. Most unsettling were the moments when I'd catch him staring at the rule sheet with an expression of intense concentration, as if he were trying to decode some hidden meaning. Once I found him in the storage room, where I'd discovered the employee notebooks, though he claimed to have been looking for cleaning supplies that were kept in an entirely different location. 3 weeks after my conversation with Harlan, everything came to a head during what had started as a routine Wednesday night shift. The evening had been unusually busy for a weeknight. A family of travelers with car trouble, 2 separate truckers stopping for coffee and directions, and a young couple who'd gotten turned around trying to find the interstate. By the time we closed the doors at 11 p.m., Kyle seemed agitated in a way I'd never seen before. "Too many people," he muttered, wiping down tables with unnecessary force. "Too many questions, too much attention." "It's good for business," I replied, though I'd found the constant stream of customers oddly exhausting myself. "Business?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You still think this place is about business?" Before I could ask what he meant, the lights flickered, not the brief dimming we'd experienced before, but a sustained strobing that made the entire diner feel like the inside of a broken television. Kyle's reaction was immediate and violent. He threw himself away from the windows, knocking over a chair in his haste to get to the center of the dining room. "Don't look," he said, his voice tight with panic. "Whatever you do, don't look outside." But the flickering continued for much longer than previous episodes, and despite Kyle's warning, despite rule number 4, I found my gaze drawn to the windows. In the strobing light, I could see shapes moving in the wheat fields beyond the parking lot. Tall, impossibly thin figures that swayed with the grain, but moved against the wind. As I watched, transfixed by horror, they began to move closer to the building. "Evan!" Kyle grabbed my shoulder, spinning me away from the window. I said, "Don't look." But it was too late. The figures had seen me watching, and I could hear them now. Voices calling my name from the darkness, dozens of them overlapping in a chorus that seemed to come from every direction at once. The sound was hypnotic, almost musical, and I felt an overwhelming urge to go outside and join them. "They're calling me," I said. Taking a step toward the door, Kyle blocked my path, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely frightened. "No, you can't go out there. Not now, not ever. But they know my name. They're asking for me specifically. That's how they work." His grip on my shoulders was painful now, his fingers digging into my flesh. "They take your voice, your face, your memories, everything that makes you who you are, and they use it to call the next person. Those voices out there. Some of them used to work in this diner." The calling continued, growing more insistent. I could pick out individual voices now, and with growing horror I recognized some of them from the notebook entries I'd read. Jennifer Martinez pleading for me to unlock the door and let her back inside. Marcus Okafor explaining that he'd learned the truth about the rules and needed to share it with me. Even voices I didn't recognize, but that claimed to be family members, friends, people I cared about, who were worried and looking for me. "How do you know all this?" I asked Kyle, fighting against the compulsion to respond to the calls. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Because I've been where they are. Because I know what it's like to be taken and changed and sent back to do their work." The admission hung between us like a physical presence. Kyle released his grip on my shoulders and stepped back, and I could see him clearly for the first time in weeks. His skin had a waxy quality that I'd somehow failed to notice before. His movements, which I'd attributed to growing comfort with his job, were actually too fluid, too precise, the movements of something that had learned to imitate human behavior without truly understanding it. "You're not Kyle," I said. "I'm Kyle enough," he replied. "I have his memories, his personality, his knowledge of this place. But you're right, the original Kyle didn't make it through his second month. He looked out the window when he shouldn't have, and they took him into the wheat. What came back was something else. Something that could do Kyle's job but serve their interests. Why are you telling me this? Because they're testing you now, because they want to see if you'll break the same way he did." He gestured toward the windows, where the voices continued their mournful chorus. "And because I've been Kyle long enough to remember what it was like to be human. I don't want to see you end up like me." The lights stopped flickering abruptly, plunging us into the steady, fluorescent illumination I'd grown accustomed to. The voices outside faded to whispers, then silence. But I could still see the figures in the wheat, motionless now but clearly waiting for another opportunity. "What happens now?" I asked. Kyle, or the thing that had been Kyle, managed a smile that was almost convincing. "Now you finish your shift. You follow the rules. You survive until morning, and then you decide whether you're strong enough to keep doing this or smart enough to quit while you still can. And if I stay, then you'll learn what the rules really mean. You'll understand why this place exists and what it costs to keep it running." He paused, looking toward the windows where the figures still waited in the wheat. "And eventually you'll have to decide which side of the treaty you're really on." The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible line. The voices had called my name, which meant they knew who I was now. More troubling, Kyle's revelation had shifted the entire dynamic of our working relationship. How do you trust someone who's admitted they're not entirely human? How do you work alongside a colleague who might be reporting your every action to supernatural entities with their own agenda? As dawn approached and Doris arrived for the morning shift change, I realized I had a choice to make. I could quit, walk away from Mel's all-night diner and never look back, leaving someone else to discover the truth about the night shift rules. Or I could stay, knowing that each night brought new risks and that the very act of survival might be changing me in ways I couldn't yet understand. Looking at Kyle as he prepared to leave, seeing the mix of human memory and inhuman purpose in his eyes, I wondered if I was already too late to make that choice. Maybe the decision had been made the moment I'd looked out those windows and heard the voices calling my name. My decision to stay at Mel's all-night diner came not from courage but from a terrible sort of curiosity. After Kyle's revelation, I needed to understand the full scope of what I'd stumbled into. The rational part of my mind insisted I should run, get in my repaired Honda, and drive as far from Kansas as my remaining money would take me. But a larger part recognized that I'd already seen too much to simply walk away. The voices in the wheat knew my name now, and I suspected that running would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Kyle and I developed an uneasy working relationship over the following weeks. He continued to perform his duties with mechanical precision, but there was a guardedness in his manner now, as if he were constantly evaluating my reactions and reporting them to some unseen authority. For my part, I studied him like a specimen, trying to understand exactly what he'd become and what that might mean for my own future. The crisis came on a Friday night in early October. During what should have been a routine shift, the evening had been unusually quiet. No customers since 9 p.m., no phone calls, no incidents with the rules. Kyle seemed more agitated than usual, frequently checking the clock and glancing toward the windows with an expression I couldn't read. Around 11:30, he announced he needed to restock supplies in the storage room and disappeared into the back of the diner. That's when I noticed the jukebox. The machine sat in its usual corner, chrome surface reflecting the fluorescent lights. I'd unplugged it hours earlier, following rule number 1, and the power cord still lay coiled on the floor beside it. But as I watched, the display panel began to glow with a soft amber light. A record dropped into place with an audible click. Music began to play, a slow, melancholy tune from the 1950s that I didn't recognize. The singer's voice was smooth and crooning, singing about lost love and endless highways. And despite knowing better, I found myself listening to the lyrics. Rule number 8 echoed in my mind. If you hear music from the jukebox while it's unplugged, don't move until it stops. I forced myself to freeze in place, gripping the edge of the counter to resist the subtle rhythm that seemed to pull at something deep in my chest. The song was beautiful in a way that made my throat tight, filled with a longing I couldn't name. My foot began to tap involuntarily, and I had to concentrate to make it stop. Don't move. Don't acknowledge the music. Don't give in to the rhythm. But the song continued, and with each repetition of the chorus it became harder to resist. The melody seemed to wrap around me like invisible threads, and I could feel my body wanting to sway, to dance, to surrender to whatever force was calling me through the music. Outside, I became aware of movement in the wheat fields. The tall figures I'd glimpsed during the light flickering were back, closer now, swaying in perfect time with the jukebox's rhythm. They seemed to be waiting for something, watching through the windows for my response to their musical summons. The diner itself began to vibrate subtly, as if the building were a tuning fork struck in harmony with the song. Coffee cups rattled on their saucers. The fluorescent lights flickered in rhythm. Even the air seemed to thicken, pressing against me from all directions. Time became elastic. The song might have been playing for minutes or hours. I lost all sense of duration as I fought to remain motionless. My muscles began to cramp from the effort of staying still. Sweat dripped down my face, but I didn't dare lift a hand to wipe it away. Where was Kyle? Had he abandoned me to face this test alone? Or was this part of some larger plan I didn't understand? The jukebox's volume began to increase, the crooning voice becoming more insistent. I could hear harmonies now, other voices joining the singer, creating a chorus that seemed to come from inside my own head. The temptation to move, to dance, to surrender to the music became almost overwhelming. That's when I heard the first knock on the door. 3 sharp raps, perfectly timed with the music's beat. I fought to keep my eyes straight ahead, not looking toward the entrance, but I could see movement in my peripheral vision. Someone or something was standing outside, waiting for acknowledgement. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Then again. At exactly 3:17 a.m., according to the clock I could barely make out through my peripheral vision, the door handle began to rattle. The sound joined the jukebox's rhythm, creating a complex percussion that seemed designed to break my concentration. Rule number 3. Don't unlock the doors after 3:17 a.m. No matter who asks. But the door wasn't locked. Kyle had the keys and he was nowhere to be seen. All that separated me from whatever waited outside was a thin sheet of glass and my own determination not to move. The voice that came through the door was Kyle's, or rather, the voice of the original Kyle, warmer and more human than the entity I'd been working with for weeks. Evan? Evan, please, I need help. Something's wrong. I can't remember how I got outside. Every instinct screamed at me to help him, to unlock the door and let him back inside. But I remembered Harlan's warnings about things that looked like people you knew, and I forced myself to remain perfectly still. I'm hurt, Kyle's voice continued, now carrying a note of genuine pain. There's something out here in the wheat. I tried to run, but it followed me. Please just open the door. The plea was heartbreaking in its authenticity. If I hadn't known what I knew, hadn't seen Kyle's eyes go dark and his humanity drain away, I would have broken rule number 3 without hesitation. Instead, I closed my eyes and focused on staying motionless until the jukebox finished its song. The music played on, seeming to build towards some crescendo that never quite arrived. Kyle's voice outside became more desperate, then angry, then began to change in subtle ways, becoming too deep, too resonant, carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. Other voices joined him. Jennifer Martinez pleading to be let back inside. Marcus Okafor explaining that the rules were lies designed to trap us. Dozens of previous night shift workers, all begging, threatening, cajoling, trying to convince me to move, to dance, to open the door, to break the rules that were the only things standing between me and whatever fate had claimed them. Through it all, I held myself rigid, fighting against every impulse to respond. My muscles screamed in protest. My mind reeled with the effort of staying focused. But slowly, gradually, the music began to fade. The jukebox's amber display dimmed. The voices outside grew quieter, then fell silent. The pressure in the air lessened, and the building's vibrations ceased. When I finally dared to open my eyes, the diner was back to normal. The jukebox sat dark and silent in its corner, power cord still coiled on the floor. Outside the windows, the wheat fields were empty and still. Kyle emerged from the storage room a few minutes later, carrying a box of napkins and acting as if nothing unusual had happened. "Quiet night," he said, setting the box behind the counter. "Very quiet," I agreed, my voice hoarse from the effort of remaining silent. He studied my face for a moment, and I saw something flicker in his dark eyes. Approval, perhaps. A recognition of what I'd endured. "The hardest part is over," he said finally. "You've proven you can follow the rules when it really matters. They'll leave you alone for a while now." "How long is a while?" Kyle's smile was genuinely sad, carrying more humanity than I'd seen from him in weeks. "Long enough for you to decide whether you're going to be one of the survivors or one of the voices calling from the wheat." As dawn broke over the Kansas plains, I realized I'd passed some crucial test. But rather than feeling victorious, I felt hollow, changed in ways I couldn't yet articulate. The night shift at Mel's all-night diner wasn't just a job, it was a trial by fire that either destroyed you or transformed you into something capable of surviving. In a world where the normal rules didn't apply, I'd survive my first real test. But looking at Kyle, seeing what survival had cost him, I wondered if there was really any difference between the monsters in the wheat and the people who learned to live alongside them. The morning after my encounter with the possessed jukebox marked a subtle but significant shift in the atmosphere at Mel's all-night diner. When Doris arrived for her usual 7 a.m. shift change, she took one look at me, disheveled, exhausted, but still standing, and nodded with what might have been approval. "Coffee's still hot," I reported, my voice steadier than I'd expected it to be. "Good," she said, hanging her coat behind the counter. She glanced toward Kyle, who was cleaning the grill with his usual mechanical precision. "Any incidents during the night?" The question seemed routine, but I caught the weight behind it. "Nothing we couldn't handle." Doris's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "That's what I like to hear. You're learning." Kyle gathered his things to leave, but before heading for the door, he approached the counter where I was finishing my final tasks of the shift. Up close, I could see that his eyes had lightened slightly, from the deep black they'd become over recent weeks. Not back to their original color. I doubted that transformation was reversible, but no longer the complete absence of humanity I'd grown accustomed to. "You did well last night," he said quietly, so Doris wouldn't overhear. "Better than most. What happens now? Now you understand why the rules exist. Now you know what you're really protecting against." He paused at the door, one hand on the handle. "And now they know you're not easy prey. That buys you time, but it doesn't make you safe. Nothing makes you safe here. You just learn to be more careful. After Kyle left, I lingered longer than usual, helping Doris set up for the day shift and trying to process what I'd experienced. The diner looked exactly the same in the morning light. Same chrome fixtures, same red vinyl booths, same smell of coffee and fryer oil. But my perception of the space had changed fundamentally. Now I could see it for what it really was. Not just a restaurant, but a fortress. A carefully maintained neutral ground, where human and inhuman forces had negotiated an uneasy truce. "You've got questions," Doris observed, refilling the napkin dispensers with efficient motions. "A few. Ask away. You've earned some answers. How long has this been going on?" "Longer than I've been alive. Probably longer than anyone remembers. This particular stretch of highway has always been problematic. The diner's just the latest in a series of way stations that have tried to manage the situation." She gestured toward the windows, beyond which the wheat fields stretched to the horizon. "Something about this land attracts things that don't belong in our world. Best we can do is establish rules that keep them contained. And the people who work here, the ones who disappear." Doris was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling on the napkin dispenser. "Some folks aren't strong enough for the night shift. Some break under the pressure. Some get careless. Some just can't accept what they're dealing with. And some—" She glanced toward the door Kyle had exited through. "Some find a different way to survive. Kyle's not human anymore, is he?" "Kyle's complicated," she said carefully. "The original Kyle, the boy I hired 6 months ago, he made a mistake. Looked where he shouldn't have looked. Went where he shouldn't have gone. What came back looks like Kyle, talks like Kyle, remembers being Kyle. For all practical purposes, he is Kyle. Just more than Kyle ever was. Is that what happens to everyone who stays long enough? Not everyone. Some people are naturally resistant to the influence. Some develop immunity over time, and some find ways to adapt without losing themselves completely." She finished with the napkins and fixed me with a direct stare. "The question is, which category do you fall into?" I drove home that morning with Doris's question echoing in my mind. My small apartment above the hardware store felt surreal after 8 hours in the supernatural pressure cooker of the diner. Normal things, television, hot shower, microwave dinner, seemed almost absurdly mundane. How do you reconcile the existence of malevolent entities in wheat fields with the banality of daytime television? That afternoon, I found myself researching the history of Route 54 and the surrounding area. What I discovered was disturbing but not entirely surprising. The highway had an unusually high rate of disappearances and unexplained accidents, particularly during overnight hours. Local newspapers from the past century contained scattered reports of travelers who'd vanished without a trace, always somewhere along the stretch of road where Mel's now stood. More interesting were the older records, territorial-era documents and Native American oral histories that referenced the area as a thin place, where the boundary between worlds was permeable. According to these sources, various tribes had considered the land sacred but dangerous, suitable only for certain ritual purposes and never for permanent settlement. The diner itself had been built on the site of at least 3 previous establishments, a trading post from the 1890s, a gas station from the 1930s, and a truck stop from the 1960s. All had eventually closed under mysterious circumstances, usually involving the disappearance of staff members during overnight hours. I was still reading when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Kyle's number. "How are you feeling?" he asked without preamble. "Tired. Confused. Like I need to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about reality." That's normal. The first real encounter changes you, opens up new ways of perceiving the world. You'll notice things now that you never saw before. As if to confirm his words, I glanced out my apartment window and saw something that made my blood run cold. In the alley behind the building, a figure stood motionless between 2 dumpsters. Too tall, too thin, wearing clothes that seemed decades out of style. It wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything threatening, but its presence felt deeply wrong. "Kyle," I said, not taking my eyes off the figure, "there's something outside my apartment." "Don't look directly at it," he said immediately. "And don't let it know you've seen it. They sometimes follow people home after a significant encounter, just to test boundaries." "What do I do?" "Nothing. Close the curtains, go about your business, pretend it's not there. It can't enter your home uninvited, and it will get bored and leave eventually. But this is important, Evan. It means they're taking you seriously now. You're not just another temporary night shift worker anymore. I closed the curtains as instructed, but I could feel the thing's presence for the rest of the day. A cold weight pressing against the edges of my consciousness. Only as evening approached did the sensation finally fade. That night, returning to Mel's for another shift, I noticed changes in my perception that went beyond simple paranoia. The wheat fields that bordered the parking lot no longer looked like ordinary farmland. They seemed to writhe with hidden movement, and I could swear I heard whispers in the wind that moved through the grain. The diner's neon sign flickered in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. Though I couldn't decipher any message, most unsettling, I found myself understanding Kyle's inhuman nature not as something horrifying but as a form of adaptation. He'd found a way to survive in an environment that destroyed most people, even if the cost was his essential humanity. Looking at him as he prepared for the night service, I wondered if I was already beginning to change in similar ways. "Ready for another night?" he asked, and I noticed that his smile seemed more genuine now, warmer than it had been since his transformation, as ready as anyone can be for this job. That's the right attitude. Remember, follow the rules, trust your instincts, and don't try to understand everything at once. Some knowledge has to be earned gradually. As we settled into our routine, I realized that my relationship with Mel's all-night diner had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer a temporary employee marking time until something better came along. I was a guardian of sorts, one of the people responsible for maintaining the delicate balance that kept much darker forces at bay. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and oddly comforting. I'd found my place in a larger cosmic order, even if that place required me to spend my nights serving coffee to inhuman entities and following rules that defied rational explanation. Looking out at the wheat fields swaying in the night wind, I could see the figures waiting just beyond the reach of our lights. They would test me again, I was certain of that. But I was also certain that I would be ready for them. After all, I was learning the rules. And in this strange new world I discovered, the rules were the only things that mattered. 3 months have passed since I wrote the previous account, and I find myself in the peculiar position of being one of Mel's all-night diner's senior night shift employees. The irony isn't lost on me. In a job where the average tenure is measured in weeks rather than months, surviving a full season makes me something approaching a veteran. Kyle and I have developed an efficient working relationship built on mutual understanding of what we're protecting against. He's taught me to recognize the subtle signs that precede supernatural incidents, the way the fluorescent lights hum in specific frequencies, how the coffee tastes slightly metallic when reality is wearing thin, the particular quality of silence that falls over the wheat fields before something emerges from them. In return, I've helped him maintain whatever humanity he has left. We play cards during slow periods, discuss books and movies, engage in the small rituals of normalcy that keep both of us anchored to the world we're defending. Some nights, when the light hits him just right, I can almost forget what he's become. Other nights, when his eyes go completely black and he moves with that inhuman fluidity, I'm reminded that my colleague is as much a product of this place's influence as the things we're guarding against. I've also taken on the informal responsibility of maintaining the record that previous night shift employees started in the storage room. Each week I add new observations to the notebooks, patterns in the supernatural activity, refinements to the rules based on close calls and near misses, descriptions of new entities that have tested our defenses. The work has changed me. I can feel it in the way I move through the world during daylight hours, more carefully, with greater awareness of the shadows between buildings and the spaces where normal logic doesn't quite apply. I've developed an instinct for recognizing others who've encountered the supernatural, a recognition that passes between us like a secret handshake. Sometimes I wonder if I'm becoming like Kyle, something that looks human but operates according to different principles. The thought should terrify me more than it does. Last week, Doris posted a help-wanted sign in the diner's window. "Overnight position available," it read. I must be reliable and willing to follow directions exactly. That's how Marcus Webb came into our lives. Marcus is 19, freshly graduated from high school, and saving money for college. He has the kind of earnest enthusiasm that I remember having when I was his age, before life taught me that the world contained darker corners than I'd imagined. When Doris interviewed him, I could see her going through the same evaluation process she'd used with me, assessing his desperation, his flexibility, his potential for survival. She hired him on the spot, Marcus. "Meet Evan," she said on his first night, gesturing toward me as I emerged from the storage room with an armload of coffee filters. "Evan's been with us for a while now. He'll show you the ropes." Marcus extended his hand with a confident smile. "Great to meet you. I'm really looking forward to this job. Heard you guys have quite a set of rules for the night shift." I shook his hand and felt a familiar pang of sympathy for what he was about to experience. "That's right. Very important that you follow them exactly." Doris mentioned that. "Seems a little excessive, but I guess every workplace has its quirks." Kyle emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, and I watched Marcus's face as he got his first look at my transformed colleague. To his credit, Marcus didn't react visibly to Kyle's slightly too dark eyes, or the subtle wrongness in his movements. Either he was particularly unobservant, or he had better instincts than most. "Welcome to Mel's," Kyle said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to seem normal. "Hope you're a quick learner." As I handed Marcus his copy of the laminated rule sheet, I found myself in the strange position of being the experienced mentor rather than the bewildered newcomer. I watched him read through the list with the same mixture of confusion and skepticism I'd felt 3 months earlier, and I remembered Doris doing the same thing with me. "Some of these seem pretty specific," Marcus observed, like why 3:17 a.m.? Why not just say, "Don't unlock the doors after 3 a.m.? "The specificity matters," I replied, settling into the teaching role more naturally than I'd expected. "Each rule exists for a reason, and the details are important. You'll understand better after you've been here a while. And people actually follow all of these, even the weird ones about not answering the payphone." Kyle and I exchanged a glance. "Especially the weird ones," Kyle said. "Trust us on that." Marcus's first week passed without major incident. He followed the rules with the careful attention of someone trying to make a good impression, though I could tell he still thought they were arbitrary workplace policies rather than survival instructions. I found myself watching him the way Doris had watched me, looking for signs of how he might handle his first real supernatural encounter. The test came on a Thursday night during his second week, when the jukebox began to glow while unplugged. I was in the storage room when I heard the music start, the same melancholy tune that had nearly broken my resolve months earlier. By the time I reached the main dining area, Marcus was standing transfixed in the center of the room, his foot tapping in rhythm with the song. "Marcus," I said sharply, "stop moving. Right now." He looked at me with confusion, his foot still keeping time with the music. "What's wrong?" "It's just a song. Rule number 8, I reminded him. "If you hear music from the jukebox while it's unplugged, don't move until it stops." "But it's not hurting anything. It's actually kind of pretty." I could see the same glazed expression in his eyes that I'd felt creeping over me during my own test. The music was working its influence on him, drawing him into its rhythm, preparing him for whatever came next. Kyle appeared beside me, moving with the fluid grace that marked his inhuman nature. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to cut through the musical enchantment. "Stop moving. Look at me." Marcus's gaze snapped to Kyle's face, and I saw him register the complete blackness of Kyle's eyes, the subtle wrongness that marked him as something other than human. The shock was enough to break the spell. Marcus froze in place, his foot finally stopping its rhythmic tapping. "Don't move," Kyle continued, his voice now gentle but implacable. "Don't dance, don't sway, don't even nod your head. Stay perfectly still until the music stops." We stood together in the center of the diner as the jukebox played its haunting melody, 3 figures locked in motionless tableau. I could see the strain on Marcus's face as he fought the urge to move, the confusion and growing fear as he began to understand that something genuinely supernatural was happening. The music seemed to go on forever, building to crescendos that never quite resolved, weaving hypnotic patterns designed to break our concentration. Outside, I could see the familiar figures gathering in the wheat fields, swaying in time with the rhythm, waiting for one of us to give in to the compulsion to dance. Finally, blessedly, the song faded to silence. The jukebox's amber display dimmed and went dark. The pressure in the air lifted, and the figures outside melted back into the grain. Marcus sagged against the counter, breathing hard. "What the hell was that?" "That," I said, retrieving his rule sheet from where he'd dropped it, "was why we follow the rules." "Exactly, completely, without question." Kyle had already returned to his normal appearance, his eyes lightening to their usual dark brown, his movements becoming more recognizably human. "You did well for your first real test," he told Marcus. "Better than most." "Test?" Marcus's voice was shaky. "That was a test?" "They all are," I replied, remembering Harlan's words from months ago. "Every night, every rule, every strange occurrence. This place tests people constantly, looking for weakness, for someone who will break under pressure. What happens if you fail?" Kyle and I exchanged another glance. "Some people disappear," I said carefully. "Others get replaced by things that look like them, but aren't quite right. And some adapt in ways that let them keep working here, even if they're not entirely human anymore." Marcus stared at us both for a long moment, processing the implications. I could see him weighing his options. Flee from this inexplicable situation and try to find a normal job, or accept that he'd stumbled into something far stranger and more dangerous than he'd bargained for. "So if I stay," he said finally, "I need to follow every rule, no matter how crazy it seems. Every rule, every time, without exception." He picked up the laminated sheet and read through it again, this time with the gravity it deserved. "And if I don't stay?" "Then you become another person who couldn't handle the night shift at Mel's," I replied. "We'll post another help wanted sign, and someone else will take your place." Marcus nodded slowly, folding the rule sheet and slipping it into his shirt pocket. "Then I guess I better learn these rules really well. As I write this account, Marcus is completing his 3rd week at Mel's all-night diner. He follows the rules with religious devotion now, having learned firsthand what the consequences of deviation might be. Kyle has taken him under his wing in the same way he once guided me. And I find myself in the position of senior mentor, passing down the accumulated wisdom of survival in a place where the normal laws of reality don't apply. The cycle continues. Someone arrives desperate for work, gets tested by forces beyond their understanding, and either adapts or gets replaced by the next desperate soul. Those who survive long enough become part of the system, guardians of a delicate balance that keeps much darker things from spreading beyond the wheat fields of rural Kansas. I don't know how long I'll last at this job. Sometimes I catch myself moving with Kyle's fluid grace, or notice that my eyes seem darker in mirrors than they used to be. The changes come gradually, almost imperceptibly, but they're real. Whether I'm becoming something inhuman like Kyle, or simply adapting to an inhuman environment, I can't say. What I do know is that someone needs to work the night shift at Mel's all-night diner. Someone needs to follow the rules, maintain the treaty, and keep the things in the wheat fields from spreading beyond their current boundaries. If that someone becomes something other than human in the process, well, that seems to be an acceptable cost for the work that needs doing. In the distance, I can hear the jukebox humming softly, though I unplugged it hours ago. Marcus is frozen at his station, remembering his lessons, waiting for the music to stop. Kyle continues his prep work with mechanical precision, dark eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights, and I sit at the counter writing in this journal, adding another entry to the record that future night shift workers will discover in the storage room. A warning, a guide, and a testament to the people who found themselves in an impossible situation and chose to do whatever was necessary to survive. The wheat is swaying in the wind outside, and somewhere in its depths, things that were once human are calling out names I don't recognize yet. But they will be names I know soon enough. Because there's always another help wanted sign to post, always another desperate soul in need of work, always another test to administer. Welcome to Mel's all-night diner. Please follow the rules, your life depends on it.